Two planes carrying 349 people speed towards each other in the evening skies above Delhi. In one of those planes, 5 pilots sit at the controls, making preparations to land. In the other, 3 pilots are climbing along their departure route. An air traffic controller sits at the top of a tower, watching 2 blips on his screen draw closer together. What do these things have in common? The people immediately in charge of the outcome, those sitting in the pointy ends of these structures, also sit at the pointy end of a vast and complex infrastructure which undergirds their actions. All of these systems and infrastructures make up the foundations for the pyramid of aviation safety, on top of which pilots and air traffic controllers sit. What you're about to see is the shocking story of what happens when the foundations of this pyramid are rotten. November 12th, 1996, 289 passengers and 23 crew stepped on board a Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 in Delhi, India. They were bound for Dadran International Airport in Saudi Arabia, a 4-hour journey. Many of the passengers were migrant workers, headed for construction and hospitality jobs in the Gulf. Flight 763 was the beginning of a long journey for them. As they settled into their seats, a few hundred kilometers to the northwest, another group of passengers was descending towards Delhi, getting ready for a much shorter trip to the Indian capital. Most of the 27 passengers on board Kazakh Flight 1907 were traders, preparing for a shopping trip to Delhi. Their plan was to buy up as much cheap textiles as they could, and to fill the plane up with them for the return journey to Kazakhstan a few days later. For several strange reasons which we'll explore in a moment, these 2 sets of passengers would come closer together than ever intended. But at least initially, as the Kazakh plane began its descent, and the Saudi plane was loaded with passengers and baggage, all was normal. In command of Saudi Flight 763 was 45-year-old Captain Khalid al-Shabaili. With just short of 10,000 hours of flying time, he was a highly experienced pilot. He had flown this route many times before, and was familiar with the peculiarities of Delhi's airspace at the time. Sitting to his right was Nazir Khan, an American captain who would be acting as first officer on this flight. He was 44 years old and was also very experienced, with more than 7,000 hours of flying time under his belt. Behind the 2 pilots was flight engineer Ahmed Idris. At 33 years old, he was the least experienced member of this flight crew, with just over 3,000 hours total experience. On this evening, these 3 pilots and their 309 passengers and crew would fall victim to a complex web of systemic inadequacies, completely beyond their control. The foundations of the pyramid, which had supported their safe passage through the skies for all these years, was about to reveal its fatal flaws. Once the pilots had completed their checklists, and all of the passengers had boarded, Flight 763 pushed back from the gate. The countdown to disaster had now begun. The time was 6:20 in the evening. As the Saudi jet pushed back, Kazakh Flight 1907 was in the middle of its descent towards the airport. It was now 90 nautical miles away, or about 170 kilometers. Along with 27 passengers, there were 10 crew on board. Even though this particular aircraft, a Soviet-designed plane called the Ilyushin 76, was just 4 years old, the technology on board was ancient. Of the 10 crew on board this flight, 5 of them were in the cockpit. To accommodate all of them, the cockpit was split into 2 decks, an upper deck and a lower deck. On the upper deck, sitting in the left-hand seat, was 44-year-old Captain Alexander Robertovich Cherapanov. He was joined to his right by 37-year-old First Officer Ermek Kozametovich Zangarov. Behind him was 50-year-old flight engineer Alexander Alexandrovich Chuprov, and 41-year-old radio operator Igor Alexeyevich Rep. And finally, sitting on the lower deck, in what might be called an original glass cockpit, was a navigator, 51-year-old Zahambek Jusenovich Apravev. This was an experienced crew. Even the least experienced pilot, the first officer, had almost 7,000 hours of flying experience. But there was one area in which the crew were all badly lacking: their level of English. This fact, combined with some quirks of the aircraft they were flying, would lead to disastrous consequences as the aircraft neared Delhi. At 6:33, The controller cleared Flight 1907 down to 18,000 feet. The radio operator acknowledged this clearance. As per the captain's instructions, he would be handling all ATC communications for the approach and landing into Delhi. And it was a rather unusual approach. In fact, every plane departing and arriving into Delhi flew an unusual route, traffic in and out of the airport. He identified the Saudi aircraft on his radar and instructed them to climb to 10,000 feet initially. Much like the pilots in the Kazakh jet, Dutta was using antiquated technology for his work. The kind of radar he had not been state-of-the-art since the 1960s. It didn't get sent any information from the aircraft electronically, but rather a radar dish at the airport sent out a signal in all directions and picked up when this signal was reflected off an aircraft. As a result of this, it could only tell the position of planes and not their altitude, or even which aircraft they were. Dutta had to take the pilot's word for it when they gave him this information. For more than a decade, there had been plans in place to install a modern radar system, but bureaucratic forces had stymied the installation of this technology. So, sitting on top of this ancient infrastructure, keeping passenger planes separated at an airport which handled a takeoff and landing every 4 minutes, was one man. One man who had to work with one piece of information per aircraft, and who had to do it all in one narrow corridor. Because there was only one route in and out of the airport, the only way the controller could keep planes separated was to keep them at different altitudes. The international standard for this vertical separation is 1,000 feet. The controller's plan was to keep the inbound Kazakh plane at a higher altitude and to let the Saudi plane pass beneath it. As the Saudi 747 continued its climb to 10,000 feet, the Kazakh plane was descending through 23,000 feet, on its way down to 18,000. It was just over 70 nautical miles from the airport at this point, or 130 kilometers. The radio operator, sitting behind the pilots, reported their position to air traffic control. The controller cleared the flight down to 15,000 feet, and asked them to report when they had reached this altitude. The radio operator acknowledged this, and the flight continued its descent. As both aircraft were now tuned in to the same radio frequency, the pilots in each plane were able to hear the transmissions from the other plane, and their conversations with air traffic control. Listening out to other aircraft in order to build a mental picture of what's going on in the airspace is a key way by which pilots can maintain their situational awareness.